Nothing is predicated on being a citizen, whether it's state or local or federal entitlements. I can't think of, if we drew all of the prerogatives of a citizen that came through the Constitution are just custom and practice. Say 50 years ago, we put them on a ledger today. Maybe some of you can think of anything that a resident can't do that a citizen can. The only thing I can come up with is hold office.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Johnny and Marlo. Today we are joined by the winner of the Conservative Book of the Year Award, Victor Davis Hanson, for his book, The Dying Citizen: How Progressive Elites, Tribalism, and Globalization Are Destroying the Idea of America. Victor is a senior fellow in military history at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. He's the author of over 24 books, including one published by ISI in 2001, Bonfire of the Humanities, Rescuing the Classics in an Impoverished Age. He lives in Selma, California. Welcome, Victor.
Thank you.
So we'll get started by kind of setting the tone for the interview, which obviously will revolve around Victor's book, by asking, Victor, could you please give us a definition of citizenship and a short history of the concept?
Well, citizenship is, I can give you start by saying what it's not. Citizens are not subjects, they're not serfs, they're not slaves, they're not residents. So it was a radical idea in the 7th and 8th century in Greece that people who were residents of defined territories were going to take on the burden of self-governance. Probably started because people wanted to pass on property to their children and they didn't want confiscation. So they made their laws, they chose their own officials. And it's always been the aberration in history. It didn't last all that long in Greece. Alexander the Great destroyed it. Rome picked it up. It faded, at least in the West, and came back at periods, glimmers in some places in the Middle Ages, but not really until the Renaissance and Enlightenment, Florentine republics. And today, as we speak, half the people of the almost 8 billion on the planet are not citizens. They don't belong to consensual government.
Victor, one of the threads you pick up on going all the way back to ancient Greece is the connection between citizenship and a strong middle class. And I'm wondering today, as you look at America with the middle class seemingly to be eroding, if you think, are there any historic parallels as the middle class and citizenship are under threat today to perhaps other threats to the middle class throughout history?
Well, I started out my academic career 40 years ago, looking at settlement patterns in Greece. And it's funny that you can actually go out in the Greek countryside and look at these work of survey archaeologists and see that there's evidence of grids where people had about a 10-acre farm from about 700 to 300. But during the Hellenistic period, that disappears. And during the Roman period, one man, Herodes Atticus, owned all of the deme of Marathon, which was, it had produced 4,000 families. So you have this aggregation of land and this tug from bottom and top. And so the difference between Greek philosophy, I think, and Greek literature and modern literature is there's no attempt at self-censorship. It's just empirical. So when you say middle class, what's so good about it, they tell you. And the theme that runs through Aristotle's Politics or Euripides' plays is that wealthy, rich people, they're not innately different than anybody else, but concentrations of wealth lead to undue influence, and government officials are the people in control, whether it's an aristocracy, make private concessions with very wealth, the power of capital. And with the poor, it's the opposite. If you just have two classes, you have a large underclass that's subsidized and is compliant. You have a middle class that is they're autonomous economically, politically, militarily. Then they wield power, and the government has to deal with them, and they have control over the government. Without it, it doesn't exist. And as I said in the book, until 2017, the middle class had declining wages for 12 years. And in terms of purchasing power and sheer numbers, it seems to be shrinking. And if California unfortunately, it's often a foretaste of what's coming. The middle class is dying in California for a variety of reasons.
So you're joining us from your home state of California, correct? And you identify that, like you just mentioned in your book, as an icon of this extinguishing citizenship, especially since the middle class has flooded the state and these high-paying tech opportunities have boomed, obviously in Silicon Valley, while the middle class has subsequently shrunk. So in what ways do you think that the technology of the 21st century and Silicon Valley has maybe obscured what American citizenship is?
We've never in the history of civilization had that concentration of wealth in such a small place. $6 trillion of market capitalization in Silicon Valley. And if you look at the agenda of the California legislature, which, remember, it's a single-party neo-Confederate system. There's no statewide Republican office holder. There's supermajorities in both of the legislatures. There's only 11 of 53 congressional representatives are Republican. So it's a one-party state. And most of the agendas that find their way into law are Silicon Valley agenda. Radical attacks on nuclear power, natural gas, water transfers, reservoirs, affordable housing, high regulation. And the result of that has been somewhere between 6 and 8 million people the last 40 years have left. So these were the traditional Pete Wilson, George Degmatian, Ronald Reagan, maybe even Arnold Schwarzenegger voter. And then we've had almost 20 million people come illegally into California over the last 40 years. And then we've had this coastal elite. And so you've got a small coastal elite from La Jolla to Berkeley. That's where the capital is. That's where the professional class lives. That's where the universities are. And then you've got a vast underclass, and we're losing entirely the middle class. They feel that given the regulations, highest gas prices in the United States, highest taxes in terms of gasoline sales tax and income tax, they get very little. They get 46th in school test scores, 48th in infrastructure rating, and so they just flee. And if you're going to have 27% of the population not being born in the United States, it's what's the resident population, that's an enormous task, challenge for people to be assimilated, integrated, intermarried, to become citizens. And if you don't believe in citizenship anymore, you don't believe in the American ideal, then people are going to understand that message. So we have large enclaves of people who like the economic security of being in California, but they're not participating in the state protocols or traditions or customs. It seems like most of them was where I live, but and so we've just neglected that. It's been part of the wealthy classes feel that people who come should be a subservient peasant class that offer valuable landscaping, nanny, work in the hospitality industry, etc. But they don't really worry that they're not becoming full-fledged citizens.
You distinguish between residents and citizens in your book. Do you think that transcends, obviously California has these class disparities. Do you think that classification transcends class? You see residents at both that peasant class, but also in the upper crust of society as well?
Yeah, I think you can really see it in Silicon Valley because we have so many people coming from all over the world as resident green card holders. And I think I want to be very careful about this. I think we're getting near 50 million people. It's the largest number in absolutes and also percentages that were not born in the United States that are now residents. Some of them are becoming citizens or are citizens. But again, when you have so many people that have not been inculcated in the Constitution or the protocols or traditions of the country, they have no idea what happened at Iwo Jima. They have no concern about what started the Civil War. They're not familiar with checks and balances or the tripartite system of government. And you're not willing to inculcate them in, because you feel some way that the system, because it's not perfect, it's not good. And so that's the crisis, that we have so many people on different agendas that are, you see every day, residents. And, I try to be empirical. I live in ground zero sort of illegal immigration. So I try to talk to people all the time. And it's both heartening that people that come here are very eager to work, and it's also disheartening that no one feels responsible to include them in the body politic. And whether that's, tough love or not, they're just operating on autopilot. It's a separate nation as far as people within 1 mile vicinity of where I work and live, I should say, where I live. They have no idea about what's going on in the United States as far as what's about or its protocols or histories or customs or traditions, and they feel that there's no need to know about it. There's no requirement. There's no reason they should know about it. Nothing is predicated on being a citizen, whether it's state or local or federal entitlements. I can't think of, if we drew all of the prerogatives of a citizen that came through the Constitution are just custom and practice. Say 50 years ago, we put them on a ledger today. Maybe some of you can think of anything that a resident can't do that a citizen can. The only thing I can come up with is hold office. Met for a while. I mean, they can vote in local elections, and now in California in school board elections. They can participate in a political campaign, serve in the military. It's travel back and forth across the border without a passport. None of us can do that. So it used to be there were very defined exclusivities of citizenship. I think they've all disappeared.
Victor, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the intersection of identity politics and national security. You talk about how identity politics is one of the more tribal kind of influences that gets people to think of themselves not so much as a citizen, being part of America, but more relying on their group identity. And you talk about how rival powers like China, for example, really want to incentivize and encourage this sort of breaking up of the American people and the concept of American citizenship. So I'm curious if you think in the long term, are there any national security implications to the internal dysfunction and disarray that we're experiencing?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think, the word tribus is from Latin, and it means three, and it's in classical Latin literature, it's always a pejorative about a pre-republican Rome that was governed but ruled by three different groups. And so tribalism was considered pre-modern. In Thucydides, he starts his history out by telling us that in the olden days, people migrated and were tribal. And then when you go and look at things in classical definitions of tribalism, it's basically the allegiance of somebody to their first cousin rather than to a meritocratic system. And we all know that. When you start to adjudicate people by their superficial appearance, then whether you know it or not, you're at war with meritocracy. And the problem it's like nuclear proliferation. When one group goes tribal for survival, as we saw in the former Yugoslavia, every group will go tribal. I've started to notice that in the San Joaquin Valley when I go to the supermarkets now. They're predominantly Hispanic, and in the very early morning, non-Hispanics will go. But because of a lot of tribalism that's been the La Raza movement and stuff, you'll see people come up to you that are not Hispanic and they'll say, "Hi, how are you?" I don't know the person. But they feel that we should have an affinity because we have a superficial resemblance. And if you turn on MSNBC and CNN and they say white supremacy, white supremacy, white supremacy, and all day long, there's such a venom there that people are going to do what other people do. But the problem with that is, of course, that's a majority population still. So you don't want to go that route. It's dangerous, and it's pre-civilizational, and whether it's Iraq or Rwanda or the former Yugoslavia, it never ends well. And it's contrary to the whole Martin Luther King content of our character, not the color of our skin. Why at this late date, at this stage of the republic, we started to re-tribalize after all of the success of the civil rights movement. And it's really what's dangerous about it, it's largely a phenomenon of the elite classes. So when you meet people who are plumbers and electricians, and they're out in they're painters of all different classes and backgrounds and races, they get along pretty well at the ground level. But people that are elite, it seems to me it's almost a competition for privileges and office holding and status among elites, so that use these tribal affiliation.
I want to pivot a little bit to education. And in your book, you identified a lack of knowledge of basic facts about American governance, civics, and history that many Americans have, and many, I'm sure, high schoolers and college students have as well. And students graduating from American high schools and also colleges aren't receiving, that quality education. Rather, they're being exposed to what we all have probably encountered one way or the other, critical race theory, which offers this very cynical view, and often a false one, of American history. So what do you think the long-term effects of the proliferation of these woke ideologies in schools and universities will be, especially when paired with some of the other issues you identify in your book, such as prolonged adolescence, the burden of college debt, the decreased likelihood that many young Americans will even be able to afford home ownership?
Yeah. There is a disconnect, isn't there, that we are the number one target of all immigrants in the world. Every poll shows that, and until recently, and I think it's only because of the Persian Gulf, we welcome more immigrants, legal and otherwise, than all other countries per annum in the world. So on the ground level, people want to come to this country, and the majority of them are not of the same race or ethnic background as the majority population in the United States. So they're risking their lives to come to a society that will be, according to what our elites say, very unfair to them, and yet they come. So there is a disconnect in what they feel and what they encounter and what they assume are different than what they're told. So that's both encouraging and discouraging. But when you have a large number of young people, or now it's into the Middle Ages, that don't know why the United States was formed and what the alternatives were to it, and they use the values of the present to go back and condemn a pre-industrial generation in a very arrogant fashion. And they have no idea that all of the leisure and affluence that's accrued to them has really been inheritable. They haven't created the wealth themselves yet. And I think increasingly they won't be able to create the wealth. Then you get a generation that history says to it, well, if you don't believe you're any better than the alternative, then you'll get your wish. There's no reason for you to continue. And so there was an op-ed in the Washington Post by a young student said that George Washington University should be changed. I thought to myself, if we put you in hiking boots and a thermal jacket and put you at Valley Forge with Washington at his side and maybe with cholera and dysentery, how well would you do? And yet, whatever you say about George Washington, he was enormously courageous and he was sick. Or if you had a slight case of smallpox, would you be able to deliver the Gettysburg Address? So the physical world is very important. So we have these young people who they tear down this and they rename that. But then you ask them two things. What would you do if you were back in that age? And second, where are the statues that are replacing these people? Is it going to be Malcolm X? I could go on a big rant about Malcolm X. So who is it? Margaret Sanger, the eugenicist that we want? So they never give us names to replace the things they tear down. And so it's a Jacobin nihilist movement. It's very similar to the French Revolution, that period between 1792 and 3 when they went out and attacked the church, the monasteries, statues. They renamed the days of the month, I went to my office one day and there was Junipero Serra Plaza, and I went on a long trip. I came back and it was gone. I said, what happened to Father Serra? He said, it's gone. I said, what was his crime? His crime was he, in the 18th century, supposedly whipped Indians. And I said, but the man walked the length of California with an infected foot trying to introduce agriculture and ameliorate the conditions of native people. He may have been misdirected, he may have been naive, he may have had counterintuitive. But he wasn't a bad person. He was a great person. Gone. And they said, well, we need to, this is very important. I don't want to go on a rant, but this last thing I want to say is that these people are very selective. So I was told by this person I was talking to that they wanted to re-emphasize at Stanford Native American people. I said, well, there would be no better way than to rename the university after an indigenous California tribe, Chumash University, because Leland Stanford was a great pioneer, but one thing we do know from his own hand, he had a pretty strong racist attitude toward Asians, and he treated them quite callously. And by every definition of contemporary Stanford University, he failed. And surely you could make a greater argument against him as illiberal than somebody 150 years earlier. But they never do that because they're invested in the name of Stanford as their brand, cattle brand, that's a entree or trajectory into a career enhancement. So a lot of what we're looking at is sort of a parlor game. It's a construct. It's easy to do this, but they always stop at particular areas that affect them. The diverse population at Harvard will never rename Harvard University. Just won't do it.
So, Johnny, unless you wanted to ask a question, we have a few minutes left until Q&A. So we'll go to the question that we ask all of our guests that appear on our podcasts, which is, how would you define conservatism?
Well, I think conservatives are people who they have a healthy skepticism about the present, and they look to guidance things across time and space from the past that have worked. And they're amenable to change, but again, they're skeptical. They think if things work and human nature, this is very important too, I think they believe that human nature is static and that it's not improved or it worsens depending on video games or nutrition. It's just, it's predictable. And therefore, wisdom of the past, with proper changes according to, different landscapes, it can be trusted, and people of the past have been constructed. And people who believe that human nature is malleable and changeable and improvable and radical, if they just have enough education, power, learning, state, they're very dangerous.
Great. Well, we've got an opportunity for some audience questions, and we have a microphone that will be going around. So it looks like Chris Long has his hand up. We'll give Chris the opportunity.
Great, thank you. Victor, to better leverage the concept of subsidiarity and to bring citizens closer to their representatives, would you be in favor of, in the recent moves towards this, but to divide California into 3 or 5 or 7 states and maybe also on the federal level to expand the number of representative or of House seats?
As long as I wouldn't end up in coastal California. I've looked at all the different schemata from 5 to 3, and the problem, of course, is that it's not just a California problem. We know what the left is trying to do now. They're trying to bring in Puerto Rico, D.C. for additionals. And so when you divide a state up, you're really talking 4 new senators, X number, maybe 5 or 6 House members, and that's going to be germane to everybody in the United States. And then when I haven't given up on California for this reason, and that is that there's something going on there. I think it's going on, but the state is self-identified as 40% Hispanic. And when you talk to people who are Hispanics, they want to know why they pay the highest electric bills, the highest gasoline bills. Their schools are rated 46. You can't go into Los Angeles or San Francisco. They're very dangerous places. Stockton's a nightmare. They ask these questions. And this was always, people like Karl Rove said, well, they're socially conservative, they're going to be Republicans. But the problem was always they came in such numbers and they were so dependent to achieve parity that they gave electoral fealty to the left. But I think now there's an autonomous middle class that's starting to slowly emerge, and the final thing is they don't like to be talked down to like anybody doesn't. And the left has this bad attitude especially this younger generation of sort of nasal intoned leftist, and they start telling people what you're going to do, and you're going to do this on Roe versus Wade, and we're going to go into the Catholic diocese in Los Angeles and disrupt it, and you're going to like that because you owe us that. And that does not go. So I think we're going to get to a 50-50 point where if your name is Lopez or Martinez, it's going to be is indicative of your political beliefs as Cuomo or Giuliani.
Looks like John Slavic has a question up front.
Yes, I believe we're in a period of pretty profound economic transition. We've never been here before with fiscal and monetary stimulus following the pandemic shutdown. What do you see as the role of the dying citizen in the midst of economic transitions, which we've been in the past? The 1920s is a good example, followed by the Great Depression. So what do you see as the future for the U.S. citizen in the midst of this economic transition?
Well, the problem is that what I'm seeing right now, especially, I don't pay all that much attention to certain statistics, but the stuff of life is about 4 or 5 things. It's shelter, the affordability of a home. And we know that we were getting pretty close to 64% of Americans could afford a home. That's falling again. When you look at fuel, the ability to move or to keep warm, that we were getting if we had this conversation 3 years ago, we would probably, even before COVID, that fuel was about as affordable as it ever had been in the country in real dollars. And yet now it's out of reach. $7 for diesel fuel in California. If you look at security, the third thing that you need to live, we were making great progress. And our major cities are not safe. People cannot go in them without. When you go to San Francisco and you see cars parked and they have signs in the window that say nothing here or unlocked, go ahead, look. And I've seen that. Then you know that the criminals are in control of the city. And then national security. So when you look at something like Afghanistan, or the moment basically this administration came into power, Vladimir Putin thought, this is another 2014 moment. So that's what I'm worried about. And the middle class person says, if I can't get a car, I can't afford food or baby formula, or I can't buy building materials, then it doesn't work any longer. And so what are we going to do? So I think that anger, there's an anger there. And I think that a lot of the pundits and the political classes have underestimated. I think they could really see a radical change in November. I mean, something not like just 2010, but even greater. There's a furor out there. And it's not just political, it's things don't work. I've had so many people say, I can't continue. I can't afford gasoline. I cannot afford Romex wire. I cannot afford plastic pipe. I can't afford paint. I can't get you this. I can't do that. It doesn't work. Or they'll say, I have 6 people living in my garage. I can't afford a home. And it's collapsing very quickly. I think we're watching it in the abstract, but on the ground level, the quality of American life is eroding geometrically, not arithmetically.
Hi, thank you for being here. My question is speaking towards education. I don't think that we're undereducated. I think we're overeducated in a really bad way. So I kind of grew up during a time when they changed from teaching civics to teaching social studies. Yeah. And I remember that from 8th grade to 9th grade. And I learned about the 3 forms of government and all the different things that we had to with the Constitution. And then that went away and we started talking about social studies. So my question is, how can we get back to teaching young people about what made this country great in the first place? Because that's what's missing. Nobody knows why this is an awesome place. Kids are being taught that America is something to be despised. How do we get back to that?
Well, that came from the schools of education. And so in the 1930s and 40s, this John Deweyism said that education was a science and they were going to certify people and they were going to set up schools of education. And they would not be professors. They wouldn't need PhDs. They wouldn't need to know the humanities. They wouldn't write a thesis. They didn't need to know 2 languages. But they were going to be doctors. So they set these schools up, and that's where the indoctrination of our school teachers takes place. And the theory, they adopt theory from sociology and psychology departments, etc. But pretty much, if you want to remedy it, you have to go to the School of Education. And I think the quickest, most efficient way would, if the Republicans came into power at the state legislatures, etc., they could just say, if you want to teach in the public schools, you have a choice. You can go the old traditional certification, get your teaching certificate, or you can get a master's, 1-year academic degree. It's taking the same time. But if you had people in there that had a year of history or a year of English, rather than going through that indoctrination for a year, you would see that most people would not select the teacher's certificate, teacher's ed. They would rather, and how funny it is, because you can graduate and get a master's degree, you can teach at a community college, you can teach at a parochial school, but you can't teach at a public school because of the School of Education. That would be very important. And as far as the universities who are teaching the teachers, it's a crime that these huge endowments are not taxable. These are political organizations. 30, 40, $50 billion are tax-free. Why they're jacking up the rate of tuition above the rate of inflation. Federal government needs to get completely out of the student loan business, $1.7 trillion in student loans. And it's almost as if you're telling the universities, you can get your loan apparatus, the government will guarantee it, and you can jack up your costs. So that would be very helpful as well. You have to do something with tenure, probably give a 5-year renewable contract, set out the items that you would. I know that there were at the CSU system, which is the largest university system in the world, for a brief moment there was something called merit pay. And it said to qualify, you had to have certain number of teaching evaluations, you had to be evaluated, you had publication. And all these people said, oh, and what are they going to do, make us write it down like we're children? They said, yes. And all of a sudden, I just, for 2 years, you would see all the faculty post things they were doing, and they would say, I've got to run home, I've got to get my article done. They would come early to class. It was kind of childlike, but it worked. And then, of course, Gray Davis got rid of it.
We got time for 2 more quick questions. Why don't I go with you, and then Bill Rivers right behind you.
Sure. You probably read Arnold Toynbee, the great historian, who talked about how many of the great civilizations in history were destroyed from within by governments that basically squeezed the life out of the economy and the creativity out of the culture. And I wonder what role you think citizens in our time have in trying to reverse that growth, if you want to put it in populist terms, taking power away from politicians in Washington, giving it back to states and people. What role do citizens have in that process, and is it even conceivable?
Well, the great threat, I think, now to citizenship is the 2 million people that work for the federal government, and 35% of all of us at some time in our life work for state, local, regional, or federal government. And that means that you have a lot of people who are unelected, and they have more power than Congress. So they have judicial, executive, and legislative power all in one. I mentioned in the book about people in my neighborhood that were said that if they had low spots in their vineyard or orchard and the water collected there, the EPA would come out without their permission and test it to see if there were nitrates under the guise of reinterpreting the Inland Waterway Act, and suggested that these were navigable rivers. And if you wanted to appeal, you appealed to an EPA judge. And so the executive and the legislature, they rewrote the law in a way it was never intended. They enforced it in a way it was never intended, and they adjudicated it. And so these people, and I was thinking the other day, think of all the people in Washington that have not been elected in the last 5 years that have lied under oath. Andrew McCabe, 4 times to a federal investigator. James Comey said he couldn't remember 245 times under oath. James Clapper said that he lied under oath, but it was the least untruthful answer. John Brennan says he lied on 2 occasions about Senate staff computers and drone attacks along the packages, but he was sorry that he lied. Lois Lerner took the 5th. Robert Mueller, the 2 incentives for his investigation were the Steele dossier and the activities of Fusion GPS. Under oath, he said he had no idea of either. Had no idea what they were. And if any of us did that to the IRS, we'd be in jail. So that's what I'm really afraid of, that we've got to get a rein on the size of government and hold people in these administrative capacities liable for crimes they commit. And we're not doing it. So that's the greatest danger. And it has been through history. I mean, French Revolution, after everybody talked about Versailles, had not changed. The 5,000 that ran the country, or at the El Escorial in the Spanish Empire, or the Kremlin, the same thing. So there's this human tendency to create these bureaucracies, but they must be, who will police the police? They have to be subject to the law. And when they're above the law and there's no consequences, I don't think there's going to be any consequences for the people who promulgated and fabricated this Russian collusion dossier. I don't think any of them will ever have to pay for that. But it caused the country an enormous amount of financial and political and cultural and social damage.
Time for one more short question.
Thank you, Dr. Hanson. You mentioned national security. My question is about China and what happens when you have citizens in the United States, or the dying citizens, who no longer believe the ideals that make America America. At the same time, you have America's greatest challenge internationally is China, where the CCP is inculcating in its citizens a sense of China's ancient history, a sense of China's greatness, and doing everything it can with the backing of a state to promote that at home, but also internationally. I guess my question is
how are we going to deal with
Yeah, how can we compete if we don't have an understanding of our own citizenship? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, for all of our pessimism, I mean, there's 1.4 billion people in China. There's 330 million Americans. And they're on the rise, and we're supposedly on the decline, but depending on which rubrics of GDP we use, they're about 70% of our GDP. I know some say higher. And so in rough figures, one American is producing much more goods and services than his 4 Chinese counterparts, even today. And you saw what they're doing in Shanghai. They shut down a large segment of their economy to ensure COVID-free population. That's impossible. This virus could come right back into Shanghai, and nobody knows how to control it. It's going to be like the annual flu. So there's limitations to that monolithic communist system, as we know. The problem is we've got to survive just like we did in the Cold War, because in the initial stages of these autocratic state totalitarian governments, they marshal enormous amounts of capital and resources and labor and population, and they strong-arm them, and for a brief period, they're very dangerous. And then the internal contradictions of them, as we saw with the Soviet Union, we see with Cuba, they all start to implode. China thinks they can break that paradigm because they're combining elements of market capitalism. I don't think they can. But I think right now it's very dangerous. They're so much more sophisticated than the Soviets. They have 340,000 students here, maybe 360,000. And they understand popular American culture. So as soon as this COVID broke out and we had a travel ban, the first thing they said was, remember, this is a country that was rounding up African students off the street in Beijing and detaining them during the first days of COVID, and a country that had shut down all internal travel in and out of Wuhan, where they knowingly allowed for 2 weeks people to leave Wuhan to Western Europe and the United States, and they had the gall to tell us that we were racist and xenophobic. And I would read these communiques, and it's traditional American racism of the 19th century. Once again, it's the exclusion. They knew chapter and verse. They knew better than our students did. And where did they get that? They got that from us. And so most people who try to do that, Bin Laden tried to do that. He said that one of the reasons he hit 9/11 was because of climate change and the lack of political reform in the United States. But they're very clumsy at it. The Chinese are not as clumsy. And they understand something about the left-wing mind in America, that they can really get to it especially when there's a lucrative investment as well. So I'm worried that we're going to have a rough 10 or 15 years with this China threat. I'm confident in the long term if we prevail, but they're the most serious threat that we've ever encountered, I think, in our 233 years.
Well, on that note, we will wrap up. Please give Victor another round of applause.